I wasn't supposed to be the one in his bed that night. The thought circled through my mind like a wounded animal, unable to find its way out. I lay there in the suffocating darkness of his private quarters, my body still trembling from the force of what had happened, the scent of him clinging to my skin like a brand that would never fade. Kong Ji-hyuk, the most ruthless alpha in the Eastern Territories, the man who had built an empire on blood and precision and the absolute refusal to acknowledge weakness in any form, was asleep beside me. His breathing was slow and even. His face, usually carved from the same cold stone as his heart, had softened into something almost peaceful. And I was the one beside him. Not one of the beautiful female Omegas I had carefully vetted and scheduled and delivered to his quarters over the years. Not one of the soft, yielding, acceptable partners he preferred when the rut took him. Not a stranger paid for discretion and silence. Me, Hanarix, his right hand, his fixer, the shadow that had stood at his back for 10 years, handling everything he couldn't be bothered to handle, anticipating his needs before he voiced them, making myself so indispensable that he would never have a reason to look too closely at what I really was. The male Omega he had trusted with everything except his body. Until tonight, I turned my head on the pillow, wincing at the deep ache that radiated through every muscle, and I looked at him. In the dim light filtering through the torn curtains, I could see the mark on his neck, a claiming bite, raw and unmistakable, the kind of mark an alpha could only receive during the most intense, unguarded moments of a rut. I had put it there. I remembered doing it, remembered the way his body had arched beneath mine, remembered the sound he had made low and desperate and nothing like the cold, controlled voice he used to command his empire. I remembered the way his hands had gripped my hips, his fingers bruising my skin, his breath hot against my throat as he whispered words I had waited my entire life to hear, except he hadn't been whispering them to me. Not really. He had been whispering them to the Omega his instincts recognized, and that Omega happened to be me. The distinction mattered. The distinction was everything. He wouldn't remember any of it. I knew that already, knew it with the same cold certainty. I used to calculate risks and manage crises and arrange the intimate details of his life. His ruts were violent, consuming, the kind that stripped away consciousness and left only primal instinct. When he woke up, he would be furious. He would demand answers. He would look at me, if he looked at me at all, with the same cold, assessing gaze he used for enemies and liabilities, and everyone who wasn't useful to his empire. And I would have to pretend that this night hadn't meant everything to me. I would have to stand in front of him, meet his eyes, and lie with the same skill I had perfected over a decade of hiding what I was. I closed my eyes, pressed my palm against my chest, where my heart was still beating too fast, too hard, too full of the desperate, hopeless love I had been carrying for this man since I was 17 years old. The love that had kept me alive through things that should have killed me. The love that had motivated me to become useful, become necessary, become the one person he trusted above all others in a world full of betrayal and violence. The love he had never seen, the love he would never want, the love that was, in his worldview, an impossibility, because male Omegas didn't inspire love in alphas like Khan Ji-hyuk. Male Omegas inspired disgust, distrust, the cold, clinical termination of something he considered a mistake of biology. This is the only time I'll ever be wanted, I thought, and the thought was so heavy, so final, that I felt something inside me crack along fault lines that had been forming for years. This is the only time. This is the only moment in my entire life when I'll know what it feels like to be held by him, to be desired by him, to exist as something more than a tool. So I'll take it. I'll hold onto it. I'll bury it so deep inside me that no one, not him, not anyone, will ever know it happened. And when morning comes, I'll go back to being invisible. I stayed until the grey light of dawn began to seep through the curtains. Every minute that passed felt like a small death, the warmth of his body beside me fading into the cold reality of what the daylight would bring. I memorized the rhythm of his breathing. I memorized the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the way his lips parted slightly in sleep, the way his hand, even unconscious, rested possessively on the space where my body had been. I memorized everything, because I knew this was the first and last time I would ever have it. Then I slipped out of his bed, gathered my torn clothes from the floor, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the fabric. I didn't let myself look back at him. I didn't let myself cry. I just moved through the quiet compound like the ghost I had always been. And when I reached my own quarters, small, sparse, functional, I stood in the shower until the water ran cold, and my skin was raw and the scent of him was finally washed away. Not from my memory, never from my memory, but from the surface, at least. The surface was all that mattered now. The morning after was worse than I had imagined, and I had imagined it 1,000 times. I was in my office, the small, cluttered room adjacent to Jayuk's private wing when the summons came. Not a phone call, not a message, just one of his personal guards appearing in my doorway, his expression carefully neutral, and the words, "Boss wants to see you." Now, I had been expecting it. I had spent the hours since dawn preparing for it, rehearsing my responses, steadying my nerves with the same cold discipline I applied to every crisis. But nothing, no amount of preparation, no decade of experience managing impossible situations could have prepared me for the look on Jayuk's face when I walked into his study. He was standing by the window, his back to me, his silhouette sharp against the morning light. The distraction in his private quarters had been cleaned up by the staff, the overturned furniture righted, the torn curtains replaced, the evidence of what had happened erased with the same ruthless efficiency that marked everything in Jayuk's empire. But the mark on his neck remained. I could see it clearly when he turned to face me. The claiming bite dark against his skin, impossible to hide. "What the hell did you do?" The words landed like ice water thrown in my face. I stopped in the center of the room, my hands clasped behind my back, my expression schooled into the neutral mask I had perfected over 10 years of service. "I don't understand the question." "Don't?" His voice was dangerously quiet. He stepped closer, and I could see the fury barely contained beneath his controlled surface. "There's a mark on my neck. My scent is mixed with an omega. My private quarters looked like a war zone when I woke up, and I don't remember anything after you entered that room last night." I said nothing. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it. "Who was here, Eric's?" He stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the familiar spice and smoke scent that had haunted my dreams for a decade. "What omega did you bring?" "Because it wasn't the one I approved." Sarah's handler reported she never arrived. She was in an accident. "Minor, she's recovering." Then who? He stopped. His eyes narrowed, sharp and assessing. I watched him reconstruct the night in his mind, filling in the blanks with the paranoia that had kept him alive. Through countless attempts on his life and power, someone took advantage of my rot. Someone accessed my private quarters during the one window when I was completely vulnerable, and you, the person responsible for my security, either let it happen or failed to prevent it. I flinched. I couldn't help it. The accusation, so close to the truth, and yet so far from it, hit me like a physical blow. "I didn't let anything happen," I said quietly. "The rot came early. There was no time. There's always time for security. That's your job. That's the only reason you're here." His voice was cold, clinical, the voice he used for enemies and traitors and people he was about to destroy. "Find them. Find the Omega who did this. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care what it costs. No one touches me without my consent," and walks away. "Ji-Hyuk, when you find them, bring them to me." His eyes met mine, and I saw something in their depths that made my blood run cold. Not anger. Anger I could handle. Anger was familiar territory. This was something else. This was the promise of violence, the absolute certainty of someone who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. "I'll deal with them personally, slowly. I'll make sure they understand exactly what happens to people who think they can use me." I stared at him, at the alpha who had held me in the darkness, who had whispered my name like it meant something, who had taken everything I had to give and given nothing back, at the man I had loved for 10 years, who was now ordering me to hunt down the person who had been in his bed, the person who was standing right in front of him. "Yes, sir," I said. "I'll find them." The words tasted like blood. The investigation consumed a compound for the next 3 weeks. Ji-Hyuk was relentless in his pursuit of the mystery Omega. He had his security team review every camera feed, interview every guard who had been on duty that night, search every corner of the compound for evidence of the intruder who had breached his private quarters during his most vulnerable moment. The atmosphere in the compound shifted, became more tense, more suspicious, more heavy with the unspoken accusation that someone among us had betrayed him. I oversaw the investigation. Of course I did. I was his fixer, his right hand, the person who handled everything delicate and dangerous and complicated. I coordinated the interviews, reviewed the footage, filed the reports. I stood in front of him every morning and delivered updates that went nowhere, leads that dissolved into nothing, dead ends that I had carefully manufactured to protect myself. No one suspected me. Why would they? I was Han Eriks, the beater, the man who had been at Joyuk's side for a decade without a single scandal, a single misstep, a single reason for anyone to look twice at me. The suppressants I had been taking for years did their work. My scent remained neutral. My demeanor remained professional. My position as his most trusted subordinate remained unshaken. But the irony was a blade I had to swallow every single day. I had been ordered to find myself, to hunt down the Omega, who had spent the night in Jayuk's bed and drag them before him for execution. Every report I delivered felt like tightening a noose around my own neck. Every fabricated lead felt like digging my own grave. "You're certain there's nothing on the cameras?" Ji-hyuk demanded, 2 weeks into the investigation. We were in his study, the late afternoon light slanting through the windows, his expression harder than I had ever seen it. "The cameras in the private wing malfunctioned that night. A power surge, possibly related to the storm. The light came smoothly, automatically. I had orchestrated the malfunction myself, exploiting the security gaps I had deliberately left in place years ago in case I ever needed to disappear. The guards on duty reported nothing unusual. Whoever accessed your quarters knew exactly how to avoid detection. An inside job." His jaw tightened. "Someone in this compound is a traitor. Someone I trusted." "Possibly." I kept my voice neutral. "Or possibly an external operative with detailed knowledge of our systems. I'm exploring both angles." He looked at me then, really looked, in that penetrating way he had that always. Made me feel like he could see straight through my carefully constructed walls. "You've been with me 10 years, Eriks. You know my operations better than anyone. If there's a weakness, a vulnerability I'm missing." "There's no weakness in your systems." I met his eyes steadily. "I've made sure of that. Whatever happened that night was an anomaly. It won't happen again." Something flickered in his expression. Something that might have been respect, or might have been the closest approximation of warmth his cold heart was capable of. "I know you've made sure. That's why I trust you. That's why you're the only one I can count on to handle this. I'm the one you should be hunting," I thought, the words screaming inside my skull. "I'm the Omega you're looking for. I'm the traitor. I'm the weakness you never saw because you never thought I was worth looking at." But I said nothing. I just nodded, accepted the weight of his trust like the death sentence it was, and continued to lie. The third week brought something I hadn't anticipated. I had been so focused on managing the investigation, on maintaining my facade, on surviving each day without breaking under the unbearable pressure of my double life, that I didn't notice the subtle changes happening in my own body. The morning nausea, I dismissed it as stress, as the natural consequence of sleeping 2 hours a night and eating only when I remembered to. The fatigue, I blamed it on overwork, on the impossible demands of serving a master who accepted nothing less than perfection. The strange, inexplicable cravings, I ignored them entirely, too exhausted to wonder why I was suddenly reading the kitchen at strange hours for foods I had never liked before. But the sensitivity was harder to dismiss. I had always had a sharp nose. It was part of what made me good at my job. The ability to detect lies and danger and hidden threats in the subtle language of pheromones. But now, every scent in the compound seemed amplified to an unbearable degree. The god's aggression, the Omega's fear, the sharp, acrid tang of Jayuk's frustration as the investigation dragged on with no results. And beneath all of it, a new scent, faint but unmistakable. A scent I should have recognized immediately but didn't, because I had never experienced it before, because my mind refused to accept what my body already knew. I finally understood on a grey Tuesday morning, when I found myself doubled over the toilet in my private bathroom, my stomach heaving, my hands trembling, my mind finally putting together the pieces I had been refusing to assemble. The suppressants. I had been taking them for years, high dose, black market, the kind that could damage your system if used too long. But during that night with Ji-hyuk, my body had been overwhelmed by his rut pheromones, overwhelmed and apparently overridden. The suppressants had failed in the face of an alpha that powerful, an alpha in the grip of instincts that recognized what his conscious mind refused to see. And now there was something growing inside me, something that had been there since that night, taking root in the darkness, changing me in ways I couldn't control and couldn't hide. I sat on the cold bathroom floor, my back against the wall, my hand pressed against my still flat stomach. My mind was blank with shock, empty of everything except the two words that kept repeating, over and over, like a death knell. Pregnant, pregnant, pregnant. I was carrying Calm Jayuk's child, the child of the Alpha who had sworn to kill the Omega who had spent the night in his bed, the child of the man who would see this pregnancy, not as a miracle, but as a threat, proof that someone had violated his control, breached his defenses, committed the ultimate betrayal. The child of the man who had never once looked at me as anything other than a tool. I pressed my palm harder against my stomach, as if I could feel the life forming beneath my skin. My hand was shaking, my whole body was shaking, but somewhere beneath the terror, and the shock, and the impossible weight of what I now carried, Something else was stirring, something I had never felt before. I'll protect you, I thought. And the thought came from a place deeper than logic, deeper than fear, deeper than the self-preservation that had kept me alive through everything. I don't know how, I don't know where, but I will protect you, even if it means running from the only home I've ever known, even if it means disappearing into a world that has never been kind to people like me, even if it means leaving him. The thought of leaving Ji-hyuk was a physical pain, a tearing sensation in my chest like something vital being ripped away. I had been his for so long that I didn't know who I was without him. My purpose, my identity, my entire existence had been shaped by the need to be useful to him, to be necessary, to be the one person he couldn't afford to lose. But I wasn't just responsible for myself anymore. There was a life inside me. A life that depended on me completely. A life that Ji-hyuk would destroy without hesitation if he ever discovered the truth. I had to leave. I had to run. Before the pregnancy became visible, before the scent changes became undeniable, before the suppressants I relied on started harming the child I carried. But leaving was impossible. Running would confirm his suspicions. Running would make me a target. Running would put not just my life at risk, but the life of the child I had never planned for, never wanted, never dared to imagine. And yet, staying was also impossible. Every day I remained in the compound, the danger grew. Every morning, I stood in front of Ji-hyuk and pretended nothing had changed. The noose tightened around my neck. I sat on the bathroom floor for hours, my mind circling through options that didn't exist, solutions that would never work, futures that felt more impossible with every passing moment. When I finally stood up, my legs were numb and my eyes were dry, and my heart was a cold, heavy stone in my chest. There was no way out. There was no way to survive this, but I had to try. The fourth week brought Ji-hyuk closer than he had ever been to the truth. I had been avoiding him as much as I could without arousing suspicion. I delegated tasks I usually handled personally. I skipped meals in the common areas, citing work that couldn't wait. I kept to my office and my quarters and the shadows, where I had spent most of my life, learning to be invisible. But Ji-hyuk was not a man who could be avoided forever. He noticed everything eventually. It was part of what made him so dangerous. He found me in the west corridor, late in the evening, when I thought he was occupied with a meeting. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, the familiar rhythm of his stride, the weight of his presence that always seemed to fill whatever space he entered. I froze, my hand instinctively moving to my stomach before I caught myself and forced it back to my side. Eric's. His voice was low, controlled. You'd been avoiding me. I'd been working. I turned to face him, my expression carefully neutral. The investigation. The investigation is going nowhere. You know that. I know that. He stepped closer, and I had to fight the urge to back away. His scent washed over me, spice and smoke and the infuriating familiarity that my Omega instincts recognized as home even when my rational mind knew he was a threat. But you've been avoiding me for weeks. Before the investigation, before the rot. Something's different. Nothing's different. Don't lie to me. His voice sharpened, and I felt the words like a blade against my skin. I've known you for 10 years, Eric's. I know when you're hiding something. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could see it through my shirt. There's nothing to hide. He stepped closer, and closer still, until he was standing directly in front of me, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that my Omega instinct screamed at me to submit, to confess, to throw myself on his mercy and hope that 10 years of loyalty meant something. But 10 years of loyalty wouldn't mean anything. Not when he learned the truth. Not when he discovered that the Omega he had been hunting was standing right in front of him. For someone who claims loyalty, Ji-hyuk said quietly, you've been acting strange. You flinch when I look at you directly. You leave rooms when I enter them. You've stopped eating with the rest of the staff. He paused, his gaze sharpening. You're hiding something from me. I want to know what it is. I'm handling a personal matter. My voice came out steadier than I felt. It's nothing that affects your operations. Everything that happens in this compound affects my operations. You taught me that. He reached out and grabbed my chin, tilting my face up so I couldn't avoid his gaze. His touch was firm, but not painful, the same touch he used when he was trying to read someone, trying to uncover the truth they were hiding. I'm going to find the Omega who did this to me. Eric's. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care what it costs. No one touches me without my consent and thinks they can walk away. My hand moved instinctively to my stomach. I caught myself too late, my fingers pressing against the fabric of my shirt, against the secret I was carrying. His eyes tracked the movement, sharpened, lingered on my hand, on my stomach, on the protective gesture I hadn't been able to suppress. And when I find them, he continued, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, I'll kill them, personally, slowly, or make sure they understand exactly what happens to people who betray me, to people who think they can use my body against my will, to people who... He stopped. His eyes were still fixed on my hand, on my stomach. Something flickered in his expression, confusion, suspicion, the beginning of a connection he hadn't made yet, but was starting to form in the back of his mind. Eric's, he said slowly. Is there something you need to tell me? For one suspended moment, I almost told him. The words rose in my throat like a flood. Desperate to be released, it was me. It was always me. I've loved you for 10 years. And I was the one in your bed that night. And now I'm carrying your child. And I had to physically clench my jaw to keep them from spilling out. No, I said. There's nothing. He held my gaze for a long moment. I could see the suspicion warring with something else, trust. Maybe. Or the habit of a decade that told him I was the one person he didn't need to doubt. Finally, he released my chin and stepped back. Find the Omega, he said. That's your only priority. Everything else can wait. Yes, sir. He turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed in the corridor, each one feeling like a countdown to an execution I couldn't avoid. I waited until he was gone. Then I pressed my hand against my stomach, really pressed, feeling the slight firmness that hadn't been there before, the physical evidence of the life I was carrying. I had to run tonight before he figured it out, before the suspicion in his eyes turned into certainty, before the man I loved became the man who killed me. I packed a single bag, essential documents, emergency cash I had been stashing for years, preparing for a crisis I had always known might come. No personal items, nothing sentimental, nothing that would give him clues about where I had gone. I moved through my quarters like a ghost, my movements efficient and automatic, my mind already racing ahead to the journey that awaited me. The compound was quiet at this hour. The guards had changed shifts. The corridors were empty. The shadows were deep enough to hide a man who had spent his entire life learning to be invisible. I knew every security blind spot. I had designed most of them myself, subtle vulnerabilities I had left in place for exactly this kind of emergency. I slung the bag over my shoulder, took one last look at the room that had been my home for 10 years. The sparse furniture, the neatly organized desk, the photograph of Ji-hyuk I kept hidden in my drawer taken years ago, before he became the cold, ruthless alpha he was now, when he had still been capable of something that looked almost like warmth. I left the photograph behind. It belonged to a version of him that had never existed, and a version of me that was about to die. The south exit was unguarded, as I knew it would be. The security cameras had a blind spot, as I had designed them to have. I slipped through the darkness without a sound, my Omega instincts guiding me towards safety, my hand pressed against my stomach in a protective gesture. I couldn't seem to stop making. The perimeter fence was the final obstacle. I had prepared for this, to a section of the fence that was slightly looser than the rest, a gap just wide enough for a slender Omega to squeeze through. I had prepared it years ago, telling myself it was an escape route for Ji-hyuk if the compound was ever compromised. But I had always known, in some deep, unacknowledged part of myself, that the person who would need to escape was me. I reached the fence, knelt down to squeeze through the gap. The cold metal scraped against my back, and I bit my lip to keep from crying out. And then I was on the other side, outside the compound, outside the only home I had known since I was 17 years old, outside the reach of the man who had owned me in every way except the one that mattered. I stood up, looked back at the compound one last time. The lights were still on in Ji-hyuk's private quarters. I could see his silhouette moving behind the curtains, pacing, restless, still hunting for the Omega he would never find. Goodbye, I thought. The word was a wound I would carry for the rest of my life. Goodbye, Ji-hyuk. I loved you. I loved you more than you would ever know. And you will never, ever see me. I turned around, faced the darkness of the forest that surrounded the compound. Somewhere out there, beyond the trees, there was a road, a town, a way out of this life I had built around a love that was never going to be returned. I started walking. My hand was still pressed against my stomach, against the life that was growing inside me, the life that had changed everything, the life that had given me the courage to do what 10 years of silent suffering had never been able to accomplish. I'll protect you, I whispered to the darkness, to the child who couldn't hear me yet, to the future that felt impossible and inevitable all at once. I don't know how, but I'll find a way. Behind me, the compound lights blazed against the night sky. Count Ji-hyuk was still awake, still hunting, still searching for an Omega who had already disappeared. He thought he was looking for an intruder. He didn't realize he was looking for the person who had been standing right in front of him all along. And by the time he finally saw me, it would be far too late.
Okay, so this was the part one of this story. This story came from a question that haunted me. Like, what happened when the person you love most would destroy you if they knew the truth? Like, Han is spent 10 years hiding what he was, a male Omega, serving an Alpha who believed Omegas like him were weak, untrustworthy, disposable. And he became invincible overnight. But one night during a rut, neither of them expected. His Alpha held him like he mattered, and now Eric's is carrying a secret more dangerous than he kept before. Like the motive behind this story wasn't to romanticize obsession or toxicity. It was to explore that painful, quiet space between being used and being chosen. Alex is not a victim who hates his alpha. He loves him deeply, desperately. But what make his choice to leave so heartbreaking? He is not running because he stopped loving him. Like he is running because he finally loves someone more. The child growing inside him. Okay. So the ending of part one isn't successful, triumphant, because Alex escaped the compound, but he walks into an unknown future pregnant alone with nothing but a bag and a promise. The true question isn't whether he survived, it's whether Jiyuk will ever realize what he lost, and whether Alex will ever stop loving him. So, if you ever felt like you were someone's temporary fix, or if you ever had to disappear to protect what matters most, this story is for you. Thank you so much for listening. So, if you want to know what happened next, part 2 will explore Jiyu Hunt for the mysterious Omega and Eric's fight to stay hidden while carrying the hair of the man who wants him dead. Will Jiyu ever realize the truth before it's too late? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happened next. Sometimes the most dangerous secret is the one hiding in plain sight.